Hello, I'm Natalie from Genealogy Stories and welcome to Twice Removed, the show where we talk about everything history related. I'm really excited to announce my guest today, Helen Tovey, or the editor of Family Tree magazine and avid genealogist. Hi Helen, how are you?
I'm very well. Yeah, I'm very excited to be here as well. Yeah, it'll be fun.
I was hoping today you could tell us a little bit about your own family history. And the question I normally start with is what made you start tracing your family tree?
Well, that is a really good question. I think I was really lucky because when I was a teenager, then my dad gave me a family tree and it was on a bit of graph paper and he'd written down some really rudimentary names. And he had always been curious about his family because back in 1967, he had been just browsing through the newspaper, just the newspaper of the day. And he'd seen this man with a name nearly the same as his name. And his name's very unusual. It's William Spencer Dwerrihouse Burke, and Dwerrihouse is rare, okay? So this guy was called William Henry Dwerrihouse Burke. And he was like, wait a minute, they're just, this got to be, who is this strange man? And so he went back and talked to his own dad and said, I've just found this guy in the paper, called William Henry Dwerrihouse Burke, nearly the same as my name. Who is he? Which point everything started unraveling because that was my dad's dad, who had allegedly died just after the First World War of war wounds. But clearly he hadn't. God. He'd gone AWOL for the next however many decades, five decades, yeah, until 1967. So obviously that begs a lot of questions. And then once you start piecing it all together, then you just can't stop. And so ever since then, it's always kind of been in the background. And I, as a teenager, I'm probably going to ravel too long. As a teenager, I didn't realize I was doing family history. We didn't call it family history. We just were piecing together the past. I don't think we ever called it a phrase, family history. We might call it a family tree, but we never called it family history. So I used to write to these old great aunts and cousins of my great aunts and just write to them and say, can you tell me about the olden days? Could you send me a postcard, whatever? And so they would send me postcards from like 1902. They go, oh, I've got this old postcard at the back of the drawer, and send me this random old stuff, which I just thought was from the olden days. And I never thought it was family history. Anyway, then I did history at uni. And then I eventually started working on practical family history and Family Tree magazine. And then I realized it was called family history. And it was only then I realized it was family history. So strange, isn't it?
No, I know. I do know what you mean. I think you just think you're exploring your past. I don't think you realize that actually you are delving into actual history sometimes. I was like you, I started off quite young as a teenager, so I think we were lucky. But those postcards sound amazing. Have you still got them?
Yes.
So your grandfather sounds like quite an interesting character. Did you ever get to meet him or?
No, I was born in 1972, so just a few years after he died, and he'd obviously become estranged from my great granny. But and I think I've learned I think some of my branches of my family, like on my mum's side, they have such a wealth of family stories which have been passed down. And then you go and research the history of it and you go, oh my goodness, these stories are true. And it all fits together just so magically. Other branches, okay, no, you have a few facts which turn out to have either no bearing on the truth, or you're like, well, I can see how you came to that, but that's not really, not really an honest interpretation of the facts. So yeah, I have lots of different ancestors. So I find his branch very interesting because I've learned a lot about myself researching his branch, because there's lots of fragmented generations. There's lots of parents who died young and the kids had a tough start in life. It's really quite a tough branch, my dad's line, to kind of piece together. It's always intriguing.
Do you think when you find those kind of families that have had that kind of fragmentation or difficulties, can you see how that's influenced future generations and slowly trickled down?
Definitely. I think that's probably the most important bit of family history, because all of us are rushing on with our lives. Sometimes, people ask you and say, are you okay or whatever, you will tell them honestly, no, I'm not okay, it's all going terribly, whatever. But on the whole, we all hold it together and we look bright and breezy. But all of us in phases of our life have difficult phases. And so I find it quite consoling to find ancestor branches like this, because I'm like, you had really tough times, you had difficult things to deal with, parents who ran away, parents who died young, parents who just weren't that good at being parents, not really like diligent. But still, you kind of, we're the survivors. Each generation who manages to carry on, we're the survivors, right from 50,000 years ago when we first stepped out of Africa. So I love it. I love finding, in a horrible way, I love finding these stories. And I definitely feel compassionate towards those ancestors. Like when I was younger, I didn't. I was much more like, oh my God, I found such a cool, gory story. And now I feel my heart goes out to them. And I also feel consoled by them, because I'm like, oh, your life wasn't perfect. My life's not perfect. It's just life. And none of us are living our life to be judged like in 50 years time. We don't take actions today and go, oh, my descendant will just love reading this about me. You don't live your life like that, do you?
No,
it happens. Yeah.
No, I agree. And like quite often when I'm having a difficult time, I'll tend to think, well, my great gran had to get on with this, or or she survived, so will I. This too shall pass kind of thing. I think it kind of
definitely
helps you realize that nothing lasts forever, and one difficult time, something completely different can be just around the corner, and you just don't know. So the negative can help you feel positive in a strange way, definitely.
Yeah, makes you feel resilient and like you can be resourceful. And lots of people say that, don't they? That our ancestors are really inspiring. They are our roots, aren't they? They kind of give you that strength and stuff. Yeah.
Definitely. I mean, and do you have any, it doesn't necessarily have to be an inspiring story, it could be funny, but do you have any favourite stories you'd be happy to share about your ancestors?
I guess it's favourite because I heard it when I first heard it when I was probably about 6. So I was very little. And my mum, this is one of the stories on my mum's side, she always used to say that her ancestor invented the roundabout, like as in the one to go, not the fun circus one, but the one literally to keep traffic from bashing into each other. And as a kid, you're like, oh, cool, that's a really important ancestor to invent a roundabout. Anyway, decades roll on, and I was looking for my Liverpool ancestors, and I came across this guy, one of those people whose parents died young. I think by the time he was about 7, he was an orphan. Anyway, he transformed his life around, ended up living in Liverpool as a saddler, and outside his shop, too many people were getting run over. So he piled up this big pile of earth outside his saddler shop in Liverpool, stuck a lamppost on the top of it, and his name was John Hastings, and it became known as the Hastings safety lamp. And he got given a certificate by Liverpool Council. His portrait's in a museum in Liverpool. And up until the Second World War, they had these Hastings safety lamps all around Liverpool, but then obviously they got melted down for the war effort. So this is quite amazing, because my mum she literally just said, oh, one of your ancestors invented the roundabout. She didn't know his name or anything. I researched it and I was like, oh my God, it's actually true. I mean, obviously there would have been, it's one of those inventions that I bet happened in loads of cities simultaneously as Victorian cities got more and more busy. Yeah. More traffic. But he invented the ones in Liverpool anyway.
I love that. Cool, I think it goes to show how amazingly random family history is.
Yeah. And he was probably just thinking, you could just imagine if someone kept having a crash outside your house, you would have a bollard, or you would talk to the council and say, can you put a chicane in? And he was just doing the Victorian equivalent, just get a shovel and pile up the earth and stick a lamppost on top.
I love that. He was obviously somebody that was quite proactive though, because, his neighbours didn't do it, he did it. So,
He's one of the reasons I love him is his obituary, which I found in the paper as well. And it said he died when he was 81, shortly after his birthday. And in his last birthday, he still had loads of neighbours, and with something we're all going to really relate to at the moment. He had loads of neighbours and friends coming round, to wish him well. And it said in the obituary that he gave lots of money to widows and orphans, which is one of those echo things. When he was an orphan, so he would have known firsthand how important it was that, just little bits of money here and there, giving it out. So he kind of paid back his good fortune with something which really resonated in his own life. And I love those echoes you get through time and lives.
Yeah, that's lovely. I love the way stories pass down families as well. So, nobody could remember his name or, any other detail, didn't remember that he was an orphan, but they just remembered that he was this person that made a roundabout.
Yeah,
so, it's so funny what kind of sticks in people's minds, you know, and passes down. And I don't know about you, but I've met distant cousins through tracing my family tree, and sometimes they'll have the same nugget of a story that's been passed down their line about your shared ancestors, and you think, oh, that's passed down like all the siblings, and then the siblings have passed that little nugget of a story, and it's got diluted and added to, and you know, got bits wrong, and but it's I always find that quite amazing.
And I think you're right, talking to those wider relations. Like, I haven't had any of that fortune, but I have, talking to my dad's sisters, like different people listen to different ancestor stories, don't they? So my aunts, you know, they just picked up different stories from listening to the generations before them than my dad listened to, just because we've all got different interests. Like, he would be really interested in, you know, the men who served in the war, and my aunts were really interested in the women. And so I learnt more, I guess, about my great granny, you know, just hearing stories from my aunts.
And do you think, it's a really tough one, but do you think you've got a favourite ancestor, or somebody you wish you could have met?
Well, oh, that is a really tough question.
I know.
There's a few. One would be the wife of the guy who was said to have died at the end of the First World War. So that's my great granny. So I did actually meet her, and she died when I was 11, and I always felt really close to her and really fond of her. And I only would see her probably once a year. We'd go up to Scotland and we'd see her, and I always she had lived in a little tiny flat. I think it had just like one bedroom and one living room. Me and my brothers always told me, really, really quiet, don't be annoying. So it wasn't like I had masses of time to spend with her, and not even necessarily really quality time, but I really loved her. Like, you know, when you really feel like I get you, I like you. Yeah. So I would like to have known her later into my life, just so I could have talked to her more. And then I guess some of the other people who I'd like to meet would be the people who are my brick walls. Say, come on then. So what actually happened? So so I'm trying to find. I'm stuck in the kind of middle of the 1700s on this McLaren line, and on the family tree, like I've only got one of these Janets, but the family tree, which everyone seems to be sharing on Ancestry, has two Janet McLarens, which are sisters, and I'm just like, I just think that's unlikely. Like, if one of them died as a baby, that makes sense. I don't know what you think, Natalie, but this is two Janet McLarens who are sisters, born 2 years apart, who die both in one dies in about 1850, one dies in about 1860. So they're living a long time, and it just feels implausible to have two Janets.
It does seem a little bit unlikely, but I have come across. Have they got any middle names?
One's got an M.
Yeah, see, I have come across. Not with a name like Janet, but like with something like Mary, like normally more Catholic families where they've named all their children Mary, but then they've given them a different middle name. So like Mary Louisa, Mary Catherine. And I've had it a couple of times where, sort of 1700, there's been like two Johns born. And the only thing I can think of sometimes is that one of them was ill. So by the time when the second one was being born, they thought the first one might not survive, so they took a chance and called them the same name.
It's just horrendous.
That's my suspicion. But I would say it's rare. It would definitely flag a red warning up to me to
it's flagging a warning up to me. So I'd love to meet them to try and untangle this. I kind of really hope that they have just got a crazy naming pattern, because I want the tree to be true. But I'm just feeling worried, and when you can't overlook the things, you've got to get to the bottom of it.
No, especially if they haven't named any other children along the same pattern either, like they haven't got two sons also called John. So
not that I found.
Janet and not Have you got one that you can think of that you've managed to smash through that gave you particular joy? Are there any, I don't know, anything that DNA solved or anything like that?
No, I mean, this Janet one is one that's actually thrown up by DNA. So there's lots of DNA corroborating stuff, but I'm just not sure that the names are right. I think we've all got in a muddle with our names on the trees. But I haven't really had much. I'm really bad at solving brick walls, and I have got a lot of them. And a couple of years ago, I started a little notebook for each of my brick walls, and I was like, right, I'm going to solve you. But I had about 10 or 11, and clearly they're not brick walls. If I was better at research, some of them are going to be solved, but I haven't solved them yet. there was a really cool one which Mary Evans solved for me. And she managed to find evidence which traced our family back to Elphin and Roscommon, and she actually found a townland in Ireland, which is Tanseyfield. So that is really exciting. This is, again, one of those stories. My dad had always had this thing that we came from Roscommon, like one of the branches, but he never had any evidence, but it was like this handed down memory. Oh, we come from Roscommon, we come from Roscommon. And this is over like 180-year memory, which, yeah, so it's an old memory. But anyway, when she did the research and actually found the townland and it was Roscommon, my dad was just so, like, you know, when you just melt, you go, yes, I just knew this was true. And yeah, so yeah, so I can't take any credit for that, but it was a really special feeling, definitely. Yeah.
No, I know me. I still have a lot of brick walls in my tree, despite, you know, researching other people's. Some of them are just, I haven't had the chance to go to the archive to have a dig around, and then others are mostly on my Welsh side, where literally everybody in the same town is called the same name. And yeah, and I'm always a bit, I don't know about you, but I'm always a bit torn between spending time trying to break down a brick wall to go further back, and actually just spending time getting to know my ancestors better. So I tend to focus less on going back as far as possible and much more on collecting stories. But I know everybody's different. For some people, trying to break down that brick wall is what they love, and that's the real challenge, and they really get into that. And I do enjoy that, but I probably enjoy trawling through newspapers more.
Yeah, and sometimes the brick wall isn't necessarily to make you go further back. It's trying to anchor something that you found. So like we've got this on one of our lines, this guy, and I've forgotten his first name, whether it's John or James, but anyway, I think it's James Macpherson, and I think his dad's John Macpherson, and he was born in France in 1818, and his dad was in the army. So we've actually got the family going further back, but what we wanted to do was try and pin down more about where he was born in France and why he was born in France. So then I ended up spending a few weeks of my spare time, you know, every moment you get, just trying to piece it together. And so his dad didn't serve at Waterloo, but was tracing the regiment he's in, which has gone right out of my head, I don't know what it was, but tracing the Army of Occupation in France after the Battle of Waterloo. And obviously you know about the Army of Occupation after the Second World War and how they divvied up Germany into all those different American, Russian, French, British sectors. But I'd never thought about there being an Army of Occupation after the Battle of Waterloo, but there was. And so I've traced the British regiments and the towns that they were based at, and the town that this little baby was born at, it was a British Army of Occupation town. So I'm like, oh, this is all piecing together. It does kind of fit. But so it was a brick wall for me to try and resolve why he was born there and when, you know, not when, I knew when, but why, and you know, get more evidence around that.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I agree. I particularly like that kind of brick wall where there's not, it's research hurdles.
And just to satisfy yourself, because they're not, I've never say anything's pointless, but they're not getting your tree any further back, and they're not finding out any more people. But I mean, that's actually what you said, is finding out more about the people that you've already found, isn't it?
Yeah, I think I don't know about you, but I kind of need as much detail as possible, because the more detail you have about the person, the more connected I feel to them, and the more interested in them I feel. But I also like to use them as a way of exploring other history. So like you were just saying, you ended up learning about what happened after the Battle of Waterloo and the army occupying France. And no, it's not the sort of thing that you would necessarily, you know, pick up a book on or decide
never
learn. But yeah, these random facts. So where are most of your ancestors from? Are you scattered about all over the place, or have you got particular groupings? Or
so very British and Irish, which my daughters, when they took their DNA tests, they're in their early 20s now, and they were bitterly disappointed about how multinational we were. so very much British, really Scottish. I've got some Orcadian ancestors, and I was really excited when I found those. And those again were ancestors which I hadn't had any family stories passed down. And I was like, we have ancestors from Orkney, and nobody's told me. I'm like, why? I think this is so exciting. I would have expected this to be the top of the stories to pass down. And they were fishermen. And what else have I got? Yeah, so mainly Scotland, and then north of England, Lancashire and Yorkshire and Ireland. And then eventually with the First World War, then people start coming down south and living around London and Sussex. But so it's really funny because I would never feel I'd feel like I was British or English, and my dad was in the army, so I've grown up all over, but I have never lived in the north of England. Like I live near Grantham now, and that feels north to me. So somebody in the north will laugh and go, Grantham, it's not north. But that's the furthest north I've ever lived.
No, yeah? I'm exactly the same. I'm a real southern fairy.
It's only a few generations you go, wait a minute, I'm not. I'm somebody northern.
I know.
Yeah.
It's funny, my granddad was, so my mum's mum is Welsh and quite proud of being Welsh. And her husband, my granddad, always said that he was a Yorkshireman and used to, joke about her Welshness and poke fun and all these kind of things. And, and then we traced his family tree and found out that 2 generations back, he was from deep North Wales. He had absolutely no idea. And he's probably more Welsh than my nan is, right?
Yeah.
Do you feel drawn to any particular place? So you mentioned London. I love researching my London ancestors, but do you have any particular place that you always seem to end up going back to research? Or
I do love my Scottish ancestors, and I haven't been to Scotland for a few years, but every time I go to Scotland, literally I just get there and I feel like a crazy tourist who's just completely besotted, but I get shivers up my arms. I absolutely love it. And there's that thing, isn't there? There's epigenetics where your cells can hold memories. And I'm like, well, I'm no scientist, and I don't want to sound an idiot, but my body seems to kind of feel like it's home.
I love that. No, I only recently learned about epigenetics, and I found that fascinating. And I could totally see how to me it makes total sense that if you were really anxious when you were pregnant because you were in fear for your life, or something really serious, how that trauma could pass down in different ways. I've read about it in a book by Ruby Wax, and it was fascinating because she was talking about her family history in the book.
Yeah,
I'll have to look up what it is now to put it in here. So that's your favorite place. Do you have a favorite time period at all?
Yeah, the 1700s. So when so Peterborough used to have this fantastic thing called the Peterborough Heritage Festival, and lots of places do it. And so, but in Peterborough they would have loads of people all dressed up from different eras, and they would make their own costumes, have their own, all their tools, their sleeping equipment, cooking equipment, everything else. And I'd love wandering around it and just chatting to everybody. And I always felt like if I could be somebody, then I would be an international textile seller in the mid 1700s, and I would be I'd be definitely a trading woman, and I would have my fantastic outfit. I would have furs from Russia. I'd be traveling over to India to buy the cottons and checking out all the lovely prints, and that would be me.
I love that. So you'd be very wealthy.
I think I would be pretty wealthy. I think I'd be really hardworking as well, though.
Yeah, I don't think I'd want to live in the past unless I was quite wealthy.
Yeah,
because I think the poor had it, very hard. So what is it about the 1700s then that you love? What about that period is
well, they're seriously entrepreneurial, aren't they? And I mean, it's definitely got the downsides, because it's the same nowadays. So they make, if you have British ancestors in the 1700s, there's a wealth of opportunity there, and there's that changing cusp of pace of time from us all stuck at home on our manorial land, not that we own them, but if we were a tenant there or whatever, and then suddenly the world, the cogs just rapidly change, and there's lots of people who do have lots of opportunities and lots of things happen, but it is at the expense of other people's lives, other people's cultures. So I definitely feel you can't ignore that, even about your ancestors. Like I've got an ancestor who I found who was in the army in the early 1800s, and he put down a slave riot, which I always find just horrendous, because and so he would have been beating slaves, wouldn't he? If he's a soldier, he's not just going to go, oh, please, can you get back to the plantation now? He's going to have been doing pretty brutal things. So I don't want to excuse him, but I do also think, like, pretty much he was just a soldier in the infantry. He wasn't an officer. So the British Army infantry, that's always drawn from people who are, the infantry are tough, like they come from poor backgrounds. So he wouldn't have come from a peachy existence back in, well, it was actually Ireland, but England or Ireland, any of the same things. So it's complex, but I find it interesting, but it's not easy.
No, I do. I have an ancestor. I've talked about this before, but I have an ancestor that I found that had was put on a local production, local theatre production, and in complete blackface in the 1920s, and it was really uncomfortable to find. But I've tried to talk about it because I don't think you can ignore it, and I think you have to kind of accept that our ancestors were racist, you know. But that doesn't necessarily mean they were awful people through and through. It just it's something that hopefully we've learned from, or we continue to learn from.
I think it's definitely a continuing learning thing, whether it
I think family history can be quite, it can confront you like that. Actually, there are times where tracing the past can make you feel quite uncomfortable.
Definitely.
And in some ways that's part of what makes it interesting as well. I think if it was all sunshine, lollipops and rainbows, it probably wouldn't be as interesting.
No, I do think you're right, and it makes you think about is how people tick and how people interact, and sometimes with that distance of time you can be find it abhorrent what people have done in the past, but I think we've got to think about what we do today, because people in the future will probably judge lots of things that we do and I think they're pretty bad, like whether it's the environment, or I'm not a vegetarian, but maybe eating meat, there's lots of things which people might be find revolting about us.
Yeah, and I think it's quite hard to explain to your descendants why things were a certain way. Like I talk about women's rights, for example, and how much that's changed. I mean, even talking to my mum, she's, you know, you notice the massive difference between somebody who was born in 1960s and somebody who was born like me in sometime in the early 80s. There is a big change, and then again, you know, I've got 3 daughters, so you can see how their lives and the things will be different. But yeah, it's hard to explain, but that's just the way how things were, you know.
Yeah,
I agree.
I've got this lovely old sewing machine, and it's came out of the Singer factory in 1947, and my great granny bought it. And just in the last week, my daughter, who's on lockdown with us, she started using it. She's like, wow, this was my great granny's sewing machine. And what I love about it, because my great granny and her husband, they were very orderly. Like, he was an engineer in the Royal Engineers in the First World War, and he's very like dapper, neat. He got medals for being neat and tidy and going out and mending the barbed wire, and he's this real like attention to detail guy. And anyway, the sewing machine has still got the little manual which it came with back in 1947, and all the little box of tools. And the manual says it has all these dinky little 1940s women looking very tidy with their little tight little apron and their perfect curls and everything. But the instructions are, get your screwdriver, get your oil, do this, do that. And the assumption, even though it's after the Second World War, the assumption is that as a woman, you're completely capable of using a screwdriver, using an oil can, fixing your own sewing machine, which I love that, because that's not necessarily the kind of 1950s view, you know, of like really separated gender roles, whereas life is more complex and history is more complex than we think. So even just reading Little Singer sewing manual, you get huge insights into how people actually ticked and what they were actually expected to do.
That is a brilliant example, because I think you do tend to think it was completely black and white, and it really isn't. You know, in some ways women were expected to do far more than they are now. That's really interesting. talking about the way things have changed, do you think the pandemic is going to change the way that we do family history in the future, or influence it at all? Or do you think things will go back to normal afterwards?
Well, you know, I really hope they don't go back to normal. Like, I hope we could revive some of the things that we did. Definitely, like us people meeting each other in person is great, and archives being able to be open, that would be great. I think almost archives is the bigger tragedy than us not being able to meet each other in person, because like the Zoom, that's just revolutionized it for all of us to be able to contact each other, just whether it's one-to-one chats or Family History Society meetings or people having online events. And in a way, things are more accessible. If you want to go to a kind of a conference in Australia, and how many people are lucky enough to actually travel around the world and go to genealogy conferences on the other side of the world? It's few and far between, whereas now we can join in wherever. So that's fantastic. Whereas archives being shut, if their stuff isn't digitized, then it just comes to a grinding halt. So that's the saddest, more woeful thing. Like, we need to make sure that there's enough funding for archives and enough procedures in place that they can open safely. That would be my biggest fear for the future, is that archives. I'm sure genealogists are so resourceful. Like, if you think of any other hobby where, quite aside from the pandemic, like genealogists, as soon as they're always looking on how can we make this work for us, how can we do something. Like, no other hobby, I can't think of a single other hobby which has taken up the web and used it in so many diverse ways. And we just casually go, oh, there's billions of records here, and there's millions of records there. And I like knitting as well. And they might go, we've got hundreds of thousands of knitting patterns. I'm like, it's not millions, is it? It's not like genealogy is.
No, I agree, and I think the way in which we use records as well. So combining, I'm thinking of things like the railway project, which I will insert here, where they've got genealogists to transcribe the railway accidents, and then the University of Portsmouth has then put those online for everybody to see, and then other people have gone off and blogged about some of the people that they found, and that wasn't necessarily part of their original remit. Their remit is they want to look at the way health and safety has changed in the workplace in railways, and actually it's evolved into this really holistic project that's really vibrant and full of stories and combines that with the statistics. So no, I agree. Best hobby ever.
Yeah. Which not a bit biased at all.
No, not at all. Same slightly. Which that leads me to my last question really well. And this is something I always ask everybody at the end. If somebody was sitting on the fence saying, I'm not sure whether to trace my family history or not, my ancestors were probably quite boring. I don't really have many stories. What would you say to them?
I would probably say that I would find out a bit about them, because literally you only need to have a few. When you watch somebody who hasn't done any family history, I love it because you feel so clever as well. So you show them a census document or a birth certificate or something like that. And when somebody, it's not sometimes it sound patronizing, but it's just like that exciting first spark. When you watch somebody first looking at a census document, we all would have been the same when we all looked at our first census. They can't read the writing. They have no idea what is happening on this page. And you see it on Who Do You Think You Are? And people do it on the telly, and they read across, and suddenly the pennies start dropping, and they decipher a name, and then they see an occupation, then they might see another occupation down the page, and they're suddenly almost like transported back in time. And they're like, wait a moment, I'm in Victorian Birmingham, and they can see that they're in the jewelry quarter because there's all these jewelry occupations or whatever. And it doesn't take much. So I wouldn't ever try and persuade someone and say, oh, it's really interesting. I'd go, let's find a document, and then the family history will work its own magic, I reckon.
I love that. I think that's brilliant. That's a really different answer as well from some of the ones I've had before. So that's really interesting. Yeah, I like that a lot. Thank you very much. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit subscribe or visit me at www.genealogystories.co.uk.